Tēnā koutou katoa ki ngā tauira o te kaupapa nei. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about potential endgame policies and strategies. I'd like to acknowledge my two co-presenters, Richard Edwards and Janet Hook. We're members of Aspire Aotearoa Research Centre based in New Zealand. Our focus is we're a collaboration of researchers working towards achieving tobacco endgames within Aotearoa and supporting efforts internationally as well. Before I move on, I'd like to acknowledge the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and Action on Smoking and Health for supporting and bringing about this series today. Really important to have these discussions to learn more about how we work towards tobacco endgames. I'd also like to acknowledge Project Sunset, another collaboration of people working towards achieving tobacco endgames internationally, and especially acknowledge the role that ASH has played in supporting and convening this group. So today, as an overview, I'm going to start off by giving an introduction to the tobacco endgame in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then talk a bit about our experience. Richard will follow up talking about endgame policies. Janet will follow up talking about some of the other policies, as well as some key points, and then talking about some additional resources at the end. So I'm going to talk about just a bit of an introduction now. So moving to an tobacco endgame, Aotearoa's experience. Aotearoa, before I go on, is another name for New Zealand. So what I'm going to talk about is why did we arrive at having an endgame in our country? What does an endgame mean to us? And thinking about from its conceptualization of we think we should have an endgame to the actual practice of implementing it. So from endgame thinking through to practice. Before I go on, I would like to start by acknowledging that when I'm talking about tobacco here today, I'm talking about commercial tobacco, so the experience of Māori, the indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We never used any psychoactive substances, so tobacco was introduced as a recreational product and it became quickly taken up, as I'll show in some of the following slides. It's not the same as the sacred tobacco that's used by Native American peoples, First Nations and those from South America who have a very sacred and traditional relationship with the indigenous tobacco plant from Turtle Island. So moving on to why an endgame in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So obviously the story starts with smoking, and here's part of our story. So this graph starts up in the mid-2000s and goes through to about 2017, I think it is. It very much tracks back the other way as well in terms of high prevalence rates. The main features here that you can see are that there's been for all population groups, so we have Māori at the top, Pacific peoples in the middle, and non-Māori or European others at the bottom. So the general trend is that there's been slow reductions in smoking prevalence over time, but there's been a reduction. Perhaps not so much for Pacific peoples. The other story there is that we've seen ongoing disparities in smoking prevalence. And while there might be reductions, an absolute reduction, the actual relative difference between these groups hasn't changed, and in some cases actually increased over time. So for Māori in 2017, smoking was more than double that of European others. But also noting that just more recently in our latest data that smoking rates have dropped by quite a bit. So for Māori, our daily smoking rates are around 20%, whereas European others are down to 7.2%. And that's partly a result of the environment that we're now in when we're starting to think about endgames, I think. You'll see a red dotted vertical line at 2011. That's just noting that our government first committed to tobacco endgame back then. But they didn't do much until 2022, and I'll also talk about that. But the point to note there is that not much was done, and we didn't see, as a consequence, we didn't see much change in smoking prevalence. So why an endgame? Well, we all know that smoking is a lethal product. We've known this since the mid-1960s. It has a huge impact on our health and well-being. We also know that there's been persisting smoking disparities over time. So as in the previous graph, you'll see that these differences between Māori and non-Māori, Pacific and non-Pacific, and other population groups. And we also think that the change, which has been a change over time, it's been good, it's been really slow, and we really want to speed things up. I'd like to just touch on smoking disparities and what might be causing them. So often when we think about smoking disparities, we think about upstream causes, often referred to as the socio and economic determinants of health, things like smoking social networks, income, education, those sorts of things. What we know is within these sorts of different determinants that for Māori, things like smoking are much higher, so there's a much higher prevalence even within these different sort of strata, I guess. And so there's something sitting behind there, and often we think about these sort of things that sit behind it as the more basic or fundamental causes. And I really like this figure here that comes from Williams and Mohammed, and they proposed a framework to study racism in health, actually. So they think about basic causes or hypothesise them in terms of the cause of colonisation or in economic and legal structures and institutional racism, how this flows into our social systems and our structural systems and affects our social status, and how this flows on into our surface causes, which is our smoking behaviours. And then we sort of think about how this flows on to our physical health. And so we've got to really think, when we think about our tobacco control programs, which is often a cessation program, and I'll talk about that soon, or say creating smoke-free environments, how much can they reduce, how much do they address these more fundamental or even upstream social and economic determinants? And should we be surprised if they can't, that we don't get much change and disparities over time? So when I talk about what's happened in Aotearoa New Zealand in the past, I like to refer to them as business as usual, and it's not a criticism, it's just this is the standard tobacco control tactics that we use. Many other countries will be familiar with it. It's really well documented in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So we talk about things like cessation support, creating smoke-free settings, limiting, trying to prevent or stop the the promotion of cigarettes through packaging, advertising, promotion, power walls, all those sorts of things. Putting health warnings, pictorial health warnings on our cigarette packets. Having high taxes. New Zealand has a very high tax, one of the highest in the world, similar to Australia. And providing targeted support for priority populations, things like targeted cessation services or providing smoke-free environment programs for Māori settings. One of the things I'd observe is that many of these types of interventions in business as usual, I would say, are agentic, i.e. they have a very much of an individual focus in the sense that it relies on the individual to make a change in their behaviour. So a cessation program relies on the individual to access a program and to actually quit. Obviously the support is a part of that as well, but the support doesn't often take into account the complex environments in which these people are in. You could argue that, say, tax is less agentic in the sense that it's less reliant on individual support. It hits them in the pocket. But there's a lot of debate about tax, and but sometimes the environment also can mitigate the overall effect of tax on some of our population groups. So the question here, as I mentioned, is can these sorts of interventions address our more structural causes? Can they address racism? Can they address the impacts of colonisation? Can they affect the way that our institutions act? I'd argue no, and I'll make these points as I go into this further slides. But just here, this slide was this is from a study conducted by a colleague, and she looked at what might happen if we can keep on doing a business as usual approach, adopting a business as usual approach. What might be the impacts on daily smoking prevalence for Māori females, which is the dotted line at the top, compared to non-Māori females. What you see is that for non-Māori females, the rate gets quite low, and we have this 5% threshold where we say, well, that's a pretty low rate. We think that's getting close to an end game for us. And you see for non-Māori females, they'll achieve it around 2025 or just thereafter. However, for non-Māori females, you'll see that their rates are much higher, and in fact, they wouldn't get to that threshold until the 2060s. So not only their rates are higher, but these rates will remain higher for a substantial amount of time. So we need to do something about this. Following on from the previous slide, this brings up the elephant in the room in the sense that we committed to a smoke-free goal back in 2011, but our government until very recently continued to do what they've always done. And so if you've always done what you've always done, you always get what you've always got, in the sense that we haven't made any changes, so why would we expect to have a huge change in smoking prevalence? We need to step beyond our business as usual approaches. And so thinking again about business as usual, yes, it probably will get us to the end game eventually, sometime in the future. We don't know because there's lots of other things coming onto the market. It doesn't address inequities very well. And it's really hard to sort of say, well, some of these more subtle measures, things like smoke-free environments, how that affects our populations and whether it does it at an equitable rate. How can we measure the impact of creating smoke-free workplaces on overall smoking prevalence. It's really hard to do. So some of that's a bit of a gnarly research problem, but it's also a problem in terms of having a direct line of sight between what we do. And so this got us thinking about what is an end game, in the sense that what are we really trying to achieve here? And I'd say that there's different ways of formulating an end game goal. So in the continuum we've got above, I don't think it's, we often see that there's a bit of a polarising debate sometimes about whether end game should be abstinence or harm reduction, and that's very much fueled by the proliferation of e-cigarettes and other alternative nicotine delivery devices. But I think it's more as a continuum, and it's almost a continuum of harm, I guess. So we might have an open market where the cigarettes are freely available. You might have a harm reduction model and a goal that's got harm reduction where we try and reduce or eliminate smoked tobacco and have things like e-cigarettes. And then you might have an abstinence model, which is about having no nicotine addiction. And your position might depend on your worldview, your ideology, practical thoughts, and sometimes a vested interest if you're the tobacco industry, to be honest. So a harm reduction approach might say, well, actually we want to get rid of the physical harm of tobacco, so e-cigarettes make sense, which is really, I think it's important. We can't discount the amount of harm that smoked tobacco causes to our physical health. But what I'd note here is often in the harm reduction debates, you're often quite a narrow focus. If we look at harm reduction in terms of other areas like drugs and other risk-taking behaviours, it's often not just about health, it's about social, economic, legal, other impacts. But we seem to have a very narrow focus, and you could argue that the focus is actually a Western biomedical focus. And sometimes you might think about, well, that's great, but what does that mean for a population like Māori or Indigenous peoples who might have a different view on health? Because we know that a basic cause of health inequities is colonisation and racism. So we've got to think about what these impacts have. And so, an abstinence model, and I'd say for Māori, often we angle towards an abstinence model because we don't see nicotine addiction as being part of our culture. Of course, we want to get rid of the smoke tobacco as a stepping stone, but we see it as much more broader. We don't want to see our young people taking up nicotine addiction because it has its own set of harms. We don't want to trade that off on a more short-term goal. So we want to get rid of the smoking, obviously, but we want to get rid of addiction, especially for our young people. And so what I'll just say here is it's really important if we start conceptualising what our end game goal is to be inclusive. So trying to think of a way of formulating a goal that includes, you could potentially include a harm reduction and an abstinence approach. So we have a smoke-free goal. Many of us think of it as a stepping stone towards a longer abstinence goal around eliminating nicotine addiction. We just got to make sure that we don't cut off our options in terms of achieving that long-term goal, and especially about around the availability of alternatives to help our smokers to quit who might not be able to quit nicotine altogether. And just recognising that as part of this, it's really important that population groups, and particularly Indigenous peoples, have a right to define health and well-being according to what they see as important, what their aspirations are. So we've got to be careful not to thrust our views on them in terms of defining our end-game goals. And many of you will be familiar when we start thinking about smoking disparities with Rose's work around population versus high-risk strategies. And the argument goes that we can adopt a population strategy, say having a smoke-free, promoting people to quit smoking at a population level. It'll have a small impact on individual smokers at the population level, or the health of population at the population level, but on the individual smoker that is, but at a population level it can have quite a large impact. It can reduce smoking rates or the harm in a significant way. However, the argument goes that because it might appeal or be more accessible or have greater benefit for people who have better resources access to those, i.e. often people who are better, more in better socioeconomic positions and so forth, that the impacts might be inequitable. So an alternative is a targeted approach where you'll see the graph on the right, where we target sectors of the population that might have higher smoking rates, so Māori, Pacific, low socioeconomics and so forth, which is important, and I think that's really, really important when we're trying to create supportive environments for if we're bringing in some of these legislations. However, the issue there is when we sort of target at this level, it's really at the palliative end in the sense that they're already smoking. It's not trying to address the causes of smoking, we're just trying to get them to stop smoking. It's hard to have a targeted approach that addresses the immediate or even more social determinant or even the fundamental causes. And so in a sense, you're almost fighting a losing battle there. Not to say that you shouldn't do it, I just think we need to have a good mix of strategies. So just sort of stepping down, some of the challenges around a pure population approach is that they tend to be utilitarian and we don't all fit the same mould, and so the impacts are going to be different for different population groups. As I mentioned, sort of the more high risk strategies perhaps don't affect the more fundamental causes. Our business as usual approaches have probably had a bit more focus on individual agency. Whereas what we want, and this is where some of the thinking is changing, is sort of challenging this population level as being always going to have a small impact or always going to produce inequities as well. Actually, you can bring about a huge change that's equitable if you have a population approach that works at the structural level. So the structure could be to do with the way our institutions work, or in tobacco control it could be specifically about the structure that makes tobacco available. But it needs to be radical as well, in the sense that it needs to make a big difference, a big change in what we're trying to do. And so here I'd just sort of like to summarise what I think we need to be really thinking about when we talk about endgame policies. So for me, an endgame policy or measure needs to be one that brings about a profound change. So it needs to bring about a big change in what's currently happening. So a big reduction in smoking prevalence or big reduction in smoking amongst smokers, or a big reduction in people taking up smoking. The impact needs to be equitable, so it needs to be fair and impact everybody in the same sorts of ways, or equitable sorts of ways, and it needs to accelerate way more than what's currently happening with our incremental approaches. I'd also say that I need to sort of emphasise that we need to have these measures, our lead measures, but they need to be supported by often what we see as business as usual, so still providing cessation support, but making sure that when we talk about end games that we have measures that have these sorts of features. We also need to think about mitigating potential indirect and unintended negative impacts. Things like, huge demand for cessation services. How can we make sure that demand's met? How do we meet stress that might be caused when people can't quit and they see that, say, the introduction of very low nicotine cigarettes is about to happen, which is going to happen in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the next couple of years. How can we address that stress? How can we prepare people for when these sorts of legislation comes in? So we need to have measures that work towards that, because these end-game measures, the lead end-game measures, are fairly blunt tools that will make a huge impact on our health and well-being. However, we need to think about their broader impacts as well. I'd also just note too that the process is really important, particularly when it comes to priority groups, and I'm thinking here about, in our experience, New Zealand Māori and Pacific peoples, is that it needs to be done with, not on, because if it's done on, it becomes a perpetuation of the basic causes, things like colonisation. So it needs to be done with, in terms of being there as advocates, decision makers, and end users of what happens, if that makes sense. And I'll talk a bit more about that, because Māori have been real advocates from the get-go and leaders in terms of wanting this to happen, particularly in terms of achieving an end game that meets the aspirations. So just in my last slide, I'm going to talk about advocacy. I'll talk about how we move from end-game thinking to end-game practice. So we don't just think about, here's the policies or the measures that we need to have for an end game, is how do we get us to that space? Because that's a program and intervention in itself. In our experience, advocacy, as always, had a huge role, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. So advocating, saying, well, we need to make a change in our business as usual, a slow incremental change, ongoing, persisting smoking disparities, inequities, health inequities is unacceptable. We have to make a change. And then bringing the wider sector, so tobacco and other sectors that might be aligned, along for it and building the support. We need the political engagement, so thinking about who are our political champions, who might bring this forward. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we've had a number of champions who A, brought it to our attention, B, carried it through to get a government decision, and C, brought a legislation through, which was just happened last year with Aisha Varel, and we talked about in the following parts of this presentation. We need to mobilise our community so they're on board, and that in many instances, before the government actually made the moves towards the smoke-free legislation, many of our communities were already there. So Māori groups, community organisations were already thinking and living tobacco-free. So there was policies about tobacco use in these settings. We need to think about how we set the agendas of politicians, so getting and meeting with them, providing documents. And one of the examples I've given here is a report that was produced, led by Richard Edwards, who's following me on this presentation, about here's a pathway to achieve a smoke-free in-game goal, or tobacco in-game goal. Here's the logic and here's the evidence to support that logic. And part of the process of developing these reports was engaging with our communities to make sure that it was consistent and met their aspirations as well. So it had this broader support. And it helped, we think it helped set the agenda for the government, for the Ministry of Health, and in particular for the Minister that came in terms of the in-game goal and the legislation that we saw that was just passed last year. Of course, the other bit of this is making sure we have population level support, so our advocacy gets into the media, there's media campaigns, because at the end of the day, this level of support is what helps, is an important part of swaying ministers as well. And as I mentioned, evidence and logic is really important, so making sure we've got the research and logic in many instances, because in our experience, not many countries or jurisdictions have done things like very low nicotine cigarettes or massive retail reduction or the smoke-free generation for that matter. So there have been small examples, but none like this, so we had to use logic as well. So I say, well, yeah, here's the research, but the logic is this is almost certainly going to happen, or we hope it's going to happen. So just finally, I'd just like to give the example of what happened in Aotearoa in terms of how we got, well, not we, my colleagues brought this idea of a tobacco-free Aotearoa into our consciousness. So it started with a person called Honi Harawira back in around 2005, who pretty much had been a long advocate of trying to address harm to Māori and the wider communities from tobacco. And he saw that we'd been focusing on our communities and the individuals, almost making it their problem for too long, and he said we had to move the focus to the tobacco industry. This was picked up by Shane Bradbrook, who promoted this idea, kaupapa tūpika kore. We needed a tobacco-free Aotearoa in New Zealand. This was followed by wide sector support and eventually led to Māori Affairs Select Committee, part of our government decision-making process. They did an inquiry into the harms of tobacco on Māori, and it was very much championed by Dame Tariana Turia, who was another Māori politician at the time. The result of that was that our Parliament of the time committed to a smoke-free goal, and that kind of set things in motion, but they did stall for quite a while, but that was kind of the groundwork that meant we had to do something, and that's where we moved to. So just in summary of the presentation is that I think in games it's important that they address persisting harm and inequities, because this is the thing that we're trying to, we recognise as a challenge with our business as usual approaches. We need to think about how the goal is defined and by who, and making sure it's an inclusive goal. We need to think about policy measures and interventions that bring about equitable and radical and timely change. We need to think about the process of making sure that our voices, our diverse voices are heard. And we need to think about not just these set of in-game practices, but how do we get to that practice in the end as well. Kia ora, I'll hand over to Richard now.
Kia ora. My name is Richard Edwards, also from the Aotearoa Research Centre, Aspire Centre. And Anna has given us an introduction to endgame ideas and why we might want an endgame and how the sort of strategies we might adopt. Now we're going to talk more about specific endgame measures. And I'll begin by saying, give a working definition of what an endgame measure is. So it's measures with the potential to rapidly, equitably and permanently reduce smoking prevalence to minimal levels when they're properly and fully implemented. And of course there's a variety of measures that fit into that category. And in the table here, we've outlined some of those, putting them into 4 categories: product-focused, user-focused, supply-focused, and institutional or structural measures. In this, the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on the highlighted measures. And the reason for that is that within Aotearoa New Zealand, those are 3 measures that have been proposed and will be implemented according to the legislation that's been passed. And that is the mandated denicotinisation of tobacco products, greatly reducing the retail supply, and introducing a smoke-free generation. So I'll now hand over to my colleague Janet Hook, who will talk about the supply side intervention and the smoke-free generation, and then I will come back and talk about the denicotinisation.
Kia ora, my name's Janet Hook. I'm one of the co-directors of the Aspire Aotearoa Research Centre, and I'll be talking today about reducing the availability of smoked tobacco products. In particular, I'll be talking about two key measures that we're introducing. The first is the reduction in the number of retail outlets selling tobacco, and the second is a smoke-free generation. We know that these policies will help young people to remain smoke-free, and they will also help people who smoke and who are trying to quit. And very importantly, both measures will also continue the denormalisation of smoking. At the end of our presentations, we'll be providing some additional resources. So if you're interested in reading further on either of these measures, there'll be some information there to guide you. Let's look first of all at reducing tobacco supply. This is a really important measure because it recognises one fundamental thing, and that is that tobacco is an intrinsically toxic product. And yet for decades now, we've been selling it as though it was an ordinary consumer item. This measure reframes the way in which we view tobacco. We know that reducing access is also associated with decreased youth smoking experimentation and subsequent uptake. So reducing the availability of smoked tobacco products is also a very important measure that will protect young people. And at the same time, we know that making tobacco harder to get removes temptation and so supports people who've smoked previously and who are trying to quit. So it removes temptation and thus reduces the risk of relapse. Limiting outlet numbers, very importantly, also reduces inequities in smoking prevalence that we know exist from one neighbourhood to another. So how could retail reduction measures actually be implemented? There are different ways in which we could do that. The first of these is to introduce proximity limits. So for example, we could say that retailers are not permitted to operate near schools or places where young people congregate or areas of cultural significance such as marae here in Aotearoa. Or we could introduce density limits. These measures would mean that retail outlets are not permitted to operate within a given distance of other retailers. We could also limit sales to specific stores. So one idea that's had some consideration here in Aotearoa is limiting sales to pharmacies, where people selling or supplying tobacco products could also provide people who smoke with advice on quitting. And another idea is a sinking lid policy, where we see the number of tobacco retail outlets diminish over time. What's the evidence for these? Well, we know that tobacco outlet density is associated with youth smoking uptake, and it's also associated with adult smoking cessation. So there's good support for density reduction measures. We know with outlet proximity that there are associations with adult smoking cessation. The associations with young people smoking are a little less clear, and we think that that's because young people typically have quite large activity zones, and so the distance between, say, their home and the nearest tobacco outlet becomes less important. So what are we actually going to do here in Aotearoa? We know that outlet numbers are going to decrease, and what's been proposed is that they will decrease from around the 6,000 that currently exist to just 600. In urban areas, the emphasis is on not allowing concentrations to continue in lower income neighbourhoods. And as I mentioned, making tobacco less accessible in these neighbourhoods will help to reduce inequities in smoking prevalence. In rural areas, the approach that the Ministry of Health is focused on is to reduce supply, but to maintain what they've described as reasonable access. So in other words, they want to avoid imposing a heavy travel burden on people who smoke, for example, by perhaps requiring them to travel in excess of an hour to purchase smoked tobacco products. So in rural areas, this different approach will avoid that kind of burden. How does that align with some of the key principles that we've identified in the Smoke-Free Action Plan? Well, as I've already mentioned, we believe that this measure is a key step in the continued denormalisation of tobacco and, of course, of smoking, of reframing both as an unaccepted product and a practice that no longer has a place. The measures will come into effect in 2024, but the impact of this measure will be a medium-term one, so it won't be as rapid as the denicotinisation measure. However, the measure will be strongly equity enhancing. As I've mentioned, it's going to reduce the tobacco swamps that we know exist in areas of higher deprivation. And importantly, this measure has strong support from Māori leaders. What's the industry response been? Well, they've come up with a two-pronged argument. They say that this will lead to the demise of small stores, that there'll be hardship and great disruption in an environment that's already been difficult post-COVID. But we need to remember that tobacco products offer a low profit margin and they are increasingly dangerous to sell, so they present risks to store owners as well as to the people who purchase and use these products. They've also predicted that the illicit market will rise, but in fact recent evidence, even evidence from reports the tobacco industry has commissioned, suggests the opposite and show that the market for illicit trade has actually declined. And more importantly, we see very little evidence that people who smoke are going to favour illicit tobacco products over other nicotine products, such as vaping products, which will remain available. Moving now to the smoke-free generation, I see this as a particularly important measure because it increases the denormalisation of tobacco and recognises that it is anything but an ordinary consumer product. It explicitly acknowledges that there is never a safe age at which people can commence smoking and challenges important misperceptions that smoking is somehow a symbol of maturity or adulthood. Instead, it recognises that tobacco is innately harmful, and here I think, and very importantly, it draws on consumer safety arguments. It recognises not that an industry has a right to sell a harmful product, but that people, instead, have a right to be protected from the harms these products bring. We know that this measure is going to be profoundly pro-equity. In this graph, you can see the difference in smoking prevalence around 2011 between Māori and non-Māori. This modelling predicted that if the measure had been introduced earlier, that difference in smoking prevalence between Māori and non-Māori would have diminished dramatically by 2025. The longer timeline over which the smoke-free generation will run has led some people to ask, is it really a true endgame measure? My answer to that question is yes, and that's for a couple of reasons. First, we know that it's strongly pro-equity. As you could see in the graph I've just shown, it benefits Māori and Pacific peoples disproportionately by dint of their younger population profile. And we also know that this is a measure that's strongly supported by Māori. I think we need to consider endgames far more broadly and focus not so much on rapid reductions in smoking prevalence, even though they're obviously what we want, but also on the wider denormalisation of a product and practice we know to be inherently harmful. I think the question we should be asking is not whether the smoke-free generation is a true endgame measure, but whether it goes far enough. Rising vaping prevalence among young people who have never smoked raises new, important and troubling questions. The most important of these, I think, merits a lot more attention, and that is, should we be creating a nicotine-free generation? We know that young people support the smoke-free generation proposal, and we now need to undertake new work to assess their support and responses to a nicotine-free generation proposal. How has the industry responded? Well, bizarrely. They've suggested the smoke-free generation removes young people's rights and freedoms, which of course is not something that addiction to nicotine would ever do. They've desperately and hopelessly tried to frame tobacco as a normal consumer product, but this obfuscation of young people's rights to a healthy and long life is easily exposed as nothing more than a very cynical, self-serving strategy. They've also argued that the measures are unproven and that they're high risk, not something that any prudent and sensible government would ever think to enact. But in fact, we know the reality is quite different. We have evidence from modelling, from surveys, from in-depth studies, and this evidence converges to show strong support for the measures. We also have evidence of the implementation of retail reduction and smoke-free generation measures in other jurisdictions. And we know that the tobacco industry is renowned for setting a standard of proof that it never meets itself. In fact, governments can feel confident in introducing these measures because of the strong and convergent body of evidence we know exists.
Thank you, Janet. So there are a variety of product-focused endgame measures that we could introduce, and these are measures that aim to make tobacco products less or completely non-addictive and much less appealing to users and less palatable to potential users. So examples might include mandated reduction of nicotine levels, as has been proposed in the Smoke-Free Aotearoa action plan, but also other measures like prohibiting design features or prohibiting all additives, so that you make the experience of smoking more aversive, less appealing, and those might be also endgame measures. But we're going to focus on the mandated reduction of nicotine levels. Okay, so this idea has been around for a while. It was first proposed by Neil Benowitz and Jack Hennefield in 1994. And the basic idea is that cigarettes and tobacco has an amount of nicotine around 10 to 15 milligrams per gram. And the proposal here is that you greatly reduce the allowed level of nicotine within smoked tobacco products, cigarettes and so on. And the typical level that's proposed is less than 2.4 milligrams, or ideally around 0.4 milligrams, which is a very low level. And they're sometimes called very low nicotine cigarettes, or VLNCs. And as a policy proposal, as an endgame measure, this is where you implement it so that all smoked tobacco products have to adhere to that standard. And that could be implemented gradually, reducing the nicotine, or it could be implemented as a one-off measure. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the implementation of mandated denicotinisation is due on the 1st of April 2025, and to a level of 0.8 milligrams per gram of nicotine or less. So this is what's going to happen in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So why do we have this measure? Well, first of all, there's a theory and a logic to it. So the main constituent of cigarettes causing addiction and craving and withdrawal symptoms is the nicotine. So people smoke largely for the nicotine. And this has been, so if you take the nicotine out, then people are much less likely to want to smoke or continue to smoke. And this is something that the tobacco industry has long recognised, and this is a quote from an internal document from 1959 from British American Tobacco, saying essentially if you brought in this measure, this could destroy the nicotine habit, i.e. end addiction, in a large number of consumers and prevent it from ever being acquired by new smokers. So the industry was clearly worried about this measure going back 60 years ago. But what's the actual evidence for this? Well, there is quite a lot of evidence. There's not evidence in the sense that the measure has not been implemented at national level, so we don't know exactly what will happen, but what we do have is a lot of trials, mostly randomised controlled trials, in which essentially people are given VLNC cigarettes and asked to smoke just those, and then followed up to see what happens with them and what their experience is. So what those trials find, and there are quite a large number of them now, is that people given the low nicotine cigarettes, they don't like them, they smoke less cigarettes, which is in contrast to what people have sometimes suggested, that people will try and compensate. They do not, provided the nicotine is at very low levels. As a result of smoking less, they're less exposed to toxins, they're less dependent, and they're more likely to try to quit, and they're more likely to quit. So these are all very positive signs which suggest that this policy, if you made all tobacco products denicotinized or very low nicotine, would have a profound impact on people who currently smoke. It's also highly plausible, although there's not evidence of this because it's not been implemented and you can't really do trials of this, that it would greatly reduce smoking uptake, because people trying smoking, young people trying smoking, would not get any sort of hit from the nicotine, so there would really be not very much in it for them to continue smoking, and they wouldn't become addicted. Another line of evidence is that people who smoke anticipate this would have a major impact, and this evidence has been drawn together into modelling studies which suggest that this will have a profound impact on smoking prevalence. So just to show you some examples of those studies, here's a recently conducted clinical trial, randomised trial, in which people who had daily smokers who had symptoms of mood or anxiety disorders and who were not planning to quit were given these low nicotine cigarettes or a reducing level of nicotine in their cigarette. And the various graphs here show what happened. The first one, the bottom left, shows that cigarette consumption, the top line is the people who were given the normal, regular cigarettes, usual nicotine content cigarettes, that's UNC, and the bottom line is the ones who were given the reduced nicotine content cigarettes, that's RNC. So you can see that they smoked less, the people given the lower nicotine concentration cigarettes as the nicotine level came down. In addition, as you would expect, because they were having less nicotine and they were smoking less, they had a lower cigarette dependence score as shown in this graph. Thirdly, because they're smoking less, they had less indicated biomarkers of toxins, in this case NNAL, which is a carcinogen-derived biomarker. So that was less in the intervention group. And interestingly, in this study, and this, remember, was a group of people who were having mood or anxiety disorders, one of the concerns about this policy is that it might increase the stress amongst people who smoke, but that was measured in several ways, actually, in this study. And the final graph here shows that really there was no difference between the groups, so suggesting that's not the case. And then perhaps the most important finding of all, the quit rates in the two groups were much higher in the reduced nicotine content group, 18% versus 4%. So very, very promising impact. And remember, this was people who were not planning to quit, so that's quite a high quit rate for people who were not intending to quit. Another line of evidence is looking at, if you ask people who smoke, what do they think would be the impact of a policy where the only cigarettes available or the only tobacco available was denicotinized. And this is a study carried out by Tracy Smith and colleagues. And in this case, the question was posed to people who smoke, but not just people who smoke, but people who had been randomized to different levels of nicotine content cigarettes in a blinded fashion. And then at the end of this was over 6 weeks, at the end of the 6 weeks, they were asked if the cigarette that you've been given in this study was the only type of cigarette available a year from now, what would you do? And around 50% of those allocated to the very low nicotine cigarettes said that they would stop smoking, whereas the percentage was much smaller amongst those who were allocated to the normal strength cigarettes. And remember, this was done in a blinded fashion, so they didn't actually know which cigarettes they were receiving. So that's strongly suggestive evidence that this would have a profound impact. And that's, as I said, that evidence has been applied in modelling studies, and this one is for Aotearoa, New Zealand, carried out by Tony Blakely and team from the University of Melbourne. And this shows that the top lines are for Māori men and women, the bottom lines are for non-Māori men and women, Māori being the indigenous population in Aotearoa. And this just shows that the policy is modelled to have a really profound and rapid impact and an equitable impact in that it narrows the difference between the groups, which are substantial at the moment, very quickly. So this is, again, a very promising line of evidence. The tobacco industry, of course, does not support this policy. They've come out in opposition to it. And the sorts of arguments they make is that it will increase the illicit market, it's untested and will be ineffective, it's unfair on people who smoke, and it represents a prohibition which is not an appropriate thing to do. With the illicit market, I think Janet has covered this a little bit. I think the response to that is that the concerns are exaggerated and that this can be addressed through enhanced enforcement and monitoring of illicit tobacco. Untested, well, of course it's untested, it's not been done before, so but someone has to do, every policy innovation has to be done somewhere first, so we think it's good that that's happening in our context. And will be ineffective, that's what the industry claims, but as I've pointed out, there's a lot of evidence which very strongly suggests it will not be ineffective, rather it will be highly effective at helping people to stop or not start in the first place. Being unfair on people who smoke, I'd say two lines of argument to that. One is, as I say, the study that I just showed doesn't show that smokers who were given these cigarettes felt a lot more stress. The other thing is, of course, I think it's unfair not to do this for people who smoke. Most people who smoke want to quit, they regret starting, they're trying to quit. So this measure would very greatly help them to quit. So it's sort of unfair not to do it, and it's very fair for most people who smoke because it will help them to quit, which is what they want to do. And de facto prohibition, I think, is not it's not a valid argument here. In the New Zealand Aotearoa context, we have other alternative nicotine products like e-cigarettes very widely available. So people who smoke can get nicotine, so we're not prohibiting the nicotine, we're not prohibiting the cigarettes. It's difficult to see how it can be argued to be prohibition. One of the things that I wanted to add on was about comprehensive and combined approaches. And one of the features, I think, of the Smoke-Free Aotearoa Action Plan is that it is a very comprehensive approach. So it includes denicotinisation, it includes smoke-free generation, it includes reduced retail supply, but it also includes enhanced mass media, communication about smoking, enhanced smoking cessation support, enhanced measures to tackle smuggled illicit tobacco, and so on, and community participation. So there's a whole range of measures in there. It's a very comprehensive approach. And I think there's a compelling logic that combining approaches is probably going to have synergistic impacts, so doing all these things together. But I think also with the specific issue of providing access to stop smoking support, smoking cessation support, I think that's a moral imperative where you're introducing these policies that you provide adequate support for people to stop smoking. So I think there's a strong logic between having a comprehensive and combined approach. There's another specific issue which is about harm reduction and the interaction between harm reduction approaches and this and measures like denicotinisation. And I think, again, there's potential synergy there in at least a couple of ways. So one way is that, as I said, it really undermines the argument about prohibition, and the fact that people who smoke have alternatives available which are less harmful, or very likely to be less harmful, means that it's more feasible and acceptable to introduce these policies. So I think that's one way that this is synergistic. The other is, of course, that so say you take the nicotine out of cigarettes, so the cigarettes are no longer satisfying and people can't get nicotine through them. If they can get that nicotine through an alternative product, then you would think that would make them much more likely to quit away from smoking because they know they can get nicotine through another means. So I think there's potential synergies there. And so there's an argument with when thinking about endgame and comprehensive policies that we should always make smoked tobacco products as unaffordable, as constrain the availability and make them as unappealing as possible because we're trying to support and prompt people to stop smoking or not start in the first place. But there's an argument that whatever the regulatory framework is, that for alternative products, providing they're likely to be substantially less harmful, you make them relatively more affordable, more available and more appealing, whilst of course also paying very close attention to not wanting to encourage use by people who don't smoke and never smokers, and particularly young people. So there's a balance there. So the key points are from this presentation. I think, as Anaru pointed out, we need to really closely think about defining the endgame goal. Is it a smoke-free goal? Is it a nicotine-free goal? And think about who decides that. Business as usual measures are, whilst they're important and they're good measures to put in place, they're likely insufficient to achieve the endgame goal, and they are likely to fail to address inequity adequately. We've pointed out there's a range of endgame measures available, but there's very limited experience of implementation. However, we focused on the New Zealand Aotearoa experience because 3 of the key endgame measures which have not been implemented at national level so far are included in that plan and will be implemented, provided that all goes ahead as the legislation says it will. Theory, a lot of supporting evidence and modelling studies suggest that these measures will have a profound and an equitable impact. But having said that, because these measures are relatively new and have not been implemented, robust evaluation will be absolutely critical to see if they do have the effects that we think, and to also look at any potential unintended adverse consequences. So there's some possible discussion points. I'm sure you can think of other ones here, but here's some that we've suggested. How do these endgame policies relate to business as usual commercial tobacco control policies? For example, do all the business as usual policies have to be in place before you consider endgame policies? There's a variety of questions there. Which end of the endgame measures, and there's quite a few of them, are likely to be the most acceptable, feasible, equitable and effective, and so on? That's an open question. How much should the experience with endgame measures from particular jurisdictions, like Aotearoa, influence practice elsewhere? Can we generalise what happens from a particular context to another one? And then what are the local or national factors which need to be considered in choosing what the endgame measure or strategy should be? We're not suggesting that the smoke-free Aotearoa strategy and the particular endgame measures will be the right approach for everyone. That will depend on local contexts, and so that needs to be considered. I'll finish by just saying that there are some additional resources, particularly for, for the Smoke-Free Aotearoa Action Plan. We have a website, our research centre, which has collected together a whole load of resources on one of our hot topics pages. And then we've also published a whole series of Public Health Communication Centre briefings or scholarly blogs on pretty much every aspect of those endgame measures and the overall plan. So I've suggested some examples there which you might like to look at, and we've considered the evidence, the issues about arguments against and why we think those are flawed, and so on and so on. So those are good things, sources to follow up. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation today, and I will sign off at that. Kia ora.